few weeks ago, and our friend Janet Andrews introduced me. It wasn't Amarin this time. I took a picture of him that I think I failed to post at our first meeting because a little lesson in marketing, and I've moved too many times in the last years that I've known you to have accomplished the same with my background. But look at this guy. Is that branding, Nelly, or what? He's taken his logo and he's got like this wood and this like metal, and he's got it backlit. He's got plants. He's got his degree up there. And look at those dimples, ladies and gentlemen.
We just need some animation and a crawl at the bottom, and that would do it.
A Chiron. What would it say, Rick? Help us out.
Oh, world's greatest. And then you just got to fill in superlatives until everybody's looking at something else.
I see. Well, with an intro like that, Scott is an accomplished man, and he's helping a number of companies now on a fractional basis. That's what they call it these days. And I was very intrigued when he told me that he was Masimo's 7th hire in business development. And you were there for, was it 14 years?
13 and a half.
I rounded up. And if I'm not mistaken, your options appreciated during that time.
Just a little bit.
Making you a very wealthy man. You don't need this shit, and yet here you are.
Well, you take enough sabbaticals and you realize you got a long life ahead of you. How do you make the most of it, and how do you help the most amount of people you can? So
well, I'm glad and grateful that you think that this is one place to invest some of that goodwill. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Hensley. Teach us something this morning, Scott.
Well, I can't thank you enough for having me. And, you know, the objective, Joe said, don't prepare anything, just get on and talk. But I can't do that because I'm a storyteller and we'd be here for hours. So I did put a couple of slides together that I'll share here if you can see it.
We can see it.
Yep. Can you see that?
We can.
All right. So this is the lovely title Joe gave the talk today. I appreciate you guys having me. Just a quick background, I guess, make me a little more human, maybe. I had a stellar 8-year career in college. I studied forensic biochem and ultimately graduated with a degree in molecular microbiology from University of Central Florida. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina with my
beautiful family.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that picture was 10 years ago. My oldest got married, and my youngest stepdaughter on the right is getting married in September, and I have the pleasure of officiating that. So that's a first. But yeah, so we've my wife was born and raised in Charlotte. I've lived here 12 years, and I spent 20 years in medical sales and sales leadership, building teams, sales teams, clinical teams, implementation teams, developing go-to-market strategies, global expansion, all that fun stuff. And I ended up starting my own consulting business as a fractional CRO. My consulting firm's called iPivx Growth Solutions. And in case you're wondering, that stands for 1 Peter 4:10, which means each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others, which is kind of summary of where I am in my life and career. So I will try to keep this as succinct as I can. I certainly feel like I have a lot I could share. I'm trying to keep it focused on what might help you guys in the audience. Originally, I just put this one slide together, but I do have one more slide that is the key takeaways. But I'll highlight some of the key lessons that I learned during my 13 and a half years at Masimo. I initially joined in 2003 as the 7th rep, as Joe mentioned. And when I left in 2017, we had been publicly traded for approximately 8 years. And we were doing $800 million a year in annual recurring revenue. And what I didn't realize at the time is that I was getting a working man's PhD in how to launch medical device and patient monitoring technologies. We launched 12 different technologies during that span. And I got to see the difference between market capture with a defined market that already had some key players in it versus breakthrough technology and trying to create a new market, right? And so what I think I may have taken for granted, but looking back on it now, what Masimo did so incredibly well were these three things. They had a clinical story, they had an operational story, and they had a financial story. And not just a story, but they had competitive advantages in each of these categories. So first and foremost, clinical. I see more entrepreneurs and startup healthcare device companies overlook the importance of the clinical evidence. And when I say clinical evidence, I don't mean the clinical trials and the data that was collected while you're developing a product. I'm talking about once it's ready to be commercialized, going out and collecting data to prove the outcome that you're going into a healthcare environment to sell them on, right? And so I'll never forget when I first joined, they sent me a laptop. I don't know if you remember the old BlackBerry with the wheel on the side and a flip phone, and this breakthrough binder that had over 100 clinical studies in it and said, good luck, call us if you need us. And I had no idea what in the world it was we even sold, right? So I realized the first thing I needed to do was go through all of the clinical work and understand clinically when I get in front of the right physician or clinician, what in the world am I even going to say, right? And so there were over 100 independent and objective peer-reviewed studies in that binder. And that was hands down like just a showstopper when we would put that on the table and leave it for any of the physicians or clinical key stakeholders. I mean, it talked specifically to every department, every patient condition. I mean, it was really remarkable. And I think I took it for granted, right? I mean, we would use it, but it wasn't until I went to other organizations and companies that I realized, man, they're lacking this. And it's really slowing down our progress, right? You can make claims all you want, but until you can show clear, repeatable outcomes that other people have done, and then you go somewhere else and they repeat the exact same process and get the same result, that was the most powerful piece. And so I won't belabor this point, and it's certainly not a Masimo infomercial by any means, but we were able to establish a beachhead in the neonatal intensive care unit, and specifically because of the clinical data. I don't know if anyone's familiar with ROP. It stands for retinopathy of prematurity, and it's caused by over-oxygenation. So a premature baby whose retinas haven't fully formed, if they get too much oxygen, it stops the formation of that retina and it causes blindness. And so with the clinical evidence, there was a brilliant physician called Dr. Sola, who I had a pleasure of getting to know. He actually lived in Atlanta where I was when I first joined. And he demonstrated that not only reducing saturation limits, it didn't need to be 100%, and using Masimo technology, the ability to reduce alarms. And long story short, the current technology on the market, when a baby would wiggle around or had compromised perfusion, they would get a false alarm. And so they would walk over, it would show a saturation of 60, they'd crank up the oxygen, they'd walk away. Most of the time the baby didn't need it, right? So long story short, some of the most compelling clinical evidence that we had was he changed protocols, policies, the oxygenation, the blenders, the whole thing, and utilized Masimo technology and showed almost 100% reduction in retinopathy of prematurity.
Do you have a single example that you were able to take with you? Because as a spiritual brother in marketing, I'm often asked, Joe, can you whip up a case study for us? And a number of times I'll interview a physician and I'll learn about their experience with the product, and we'll have a nice glamour shot and a picture of the product and what this physician did and how great it was, etc. Call your sales rep for more information. I don't think that's what you're talking about. I think yours is black and white and has statistics on it and is published in the journal of something important.
You're exactly right. And so not only was the outcome proven, peer reviewed, certainly ridiculed. What they then did was he was a neonatologist over multiple hospitals. They went to another hospital that had a competitive product. He implemented all the policies, procedures, everything with the exception of the technology, right? So using the competitor's technology mirrored everything that happened in the previous study, zero change in outcome. Second phase of that study, now let's overlay Masimo technology. Boom, there goes the reduction in ROP, right? So it was sort of a clear evidence-based the technology has a major component to it, right? And then they went and repeated it a third time. So we could walk into a neonatal intensive care unit, share those 3 studies, and we would get almost every neonatologist on board. It was one of their top priorities to reduce ROP, of course. I mean, that's a major clinical outcome that when you have evidence that shows how you can almost eliminate it, why would you not do something? So alarms and alarm fatigue, you guys have probably all heard this. We're going way back before that was a thing. And I would say one of the more compelling things that I love to do is walk in with our device, go into an ICU, find an empty room, get all the nurses and respiratory therapists in there, hook up their current pulse ox on my finger, put our monitor on my other finger and go like this and watch theirs just start alarming like crazy and ours didn't. Right. So you immediately get these like, oh my gosh, when are we getting this? Right. So the alarm fatigue was real, but it was so easy to demonstrate. And then through evaluations, we realized that we didn't need to go in and convince the entire hospital for 6 months that this was a better thing. We would go find the most challenging patient where they couldn't get a reading or were getting a ton of alarms. We would put our device on, collect data, and usually within an hour or 2, we had all the evidence we needed. We would pull it out, right? We would do that a few times and stop the evaluation. Most hospitals want to do evals for 6 months. I highly recommend you don't do that for a couple of reasons. Sometimes they're looking for free product to reduce their cost for 6 months. Other times you can really lose momentum, not only clinical momentum, but your champions, they just kind of lose the luster for it, and your product also can end up just kind of becoming like, yeah, I mean, it's better, but is it really worth all this work, right? So you really want to maximize your clinical stakeholders, their excitement, pull it out. And sometimes I hate to say this, but we would do it if our technology was the only one on a patient. We might leave it with them so that they could monitor that patient, certainly wanted to do the right thing. But when deals would start to stall, we would go in and say, I'm really sorry, but I need to take this out. We need it for another evaluation. And that's when the fire really lit underneath the clinicians in the hospital to do something, right? Operational.
No,
here.
before you go, I have a number of questions. Again, from my experience, I never consulted for a Masimo. I've consulted, as I suspect you are, for a number of startups who aspire for that kind of greatness. First, I've known none that have done the kind of post-market surveillance work that you suggest. I know that's a deficiency and why you're telling us how important it is. But I can recall, and granted, this was during the COVID years and everything stopped, so it'd be interesting to hear how you might have dealt with that, but table that for a moment. You said, well, they'll want to do 6 months. I encourage you not to do that. Isn't, in this case, the hospital the customer, and they tell you what they're willing to do? Because from a BATNA perspective of who needs who more, you need that evidence, you need that sale. You have more to lose than they do based on them not being aware of what the value proposition is. So when you start, it's imbalanced of how badly you want to do something and them accommodating you, and well, this is going to require an operational change, and I'm going to have to get this through. So if you find someone, in my experience, they're like, yeah, you tell us whatever the terms are, and we'll have the product there, and we'll have a trainer there, and yeah, whatever you're willing to put together, instead of something that can be measured and put black and white statistics and published in a journal. It's more anecdotal and not really well documented. How did you accomplish what you needed to build that terrific book?
Well, that terrific book, that might be a sidebar conversation, because a majority of all of that information was captured and published before I joined, right? So when I joined, I think they were doing maybe like 15 million. And when I was hired, they split the territory. I had 2.5 states, and I had 2 customers in that geography, right? So they had, so with any product that you're launching, right, the curve of adoption, right? And so you've got those early adopters, like you have to spend your time with them, right? And most of the time they need some type of, well, a lot of academia, they want to be published, right? And so early on, you have to do that. You have to work with them.
Were your clients university-based institutions?
Some of them were. A lot of the research that was done in academia. Yes.
Mhm.
And they became some of our earliest adopters. But once we had that sort of broad, compelling evidence, we really shied away from everyone else that wanted to do a study, right? Unless they wanted to do a study that had never been done before, we didn't want them redoing a study that we already had evidence on, because it would just detract from, like, use Emory University as an example. Maybe I shouldn't have said their name, but they wanted to do another study in anesthesia, and we already had those studies.
Right,
And
you had a marquee, perfect
Yeah.
example. There's no reason to reshoot that ad.
it would delay us earning their business for 3 years,
Mhm.
right? And so a lot of times we would table it and say, look, we're willing to entertain that with you, right? But first and foremost, you're in a critical situation where you're about to make a decision on what patient monitors you're moving forward with hospital wide.
Mhm.
If you want to do a abbreviated evaluation to prove that technology is better than what you're using, so you can spec them when they're coming in, right? We can certainly accommodate that. But going back to your original question, yes, hospitals do try to dictate evaluation terms, right? What's interesting is you can lose a lot of time and spin your wheels. And I mean, I'm just saying, if we did longer than a 2-week evaluation, we lost so much momentum that you could add another 12 to 24 months on that sales cycle. Because you have to get in, you have to prove what you're looking to do and get out. What we would oftentimes do is work with our clinical key stakeholders and say, what other information do you need in order to make an informed decision? What are you looking for in an evaluation, right? So 6 months, why 6 months? And I think pushing back just by asking them more questions, what are you looking to accomplish in 6 months, right? Well, we really need to see if it'll work. What's that in? How many, right? Is it 100? Because I could bring in 10 devices. We can do that in a week, right? Is what is the objective, and what does a successful evaluation look like to you, right? And so even if we needed to go multiple departments, like have a whole SWAT team come in to do this eval, the shorter the better. We could collect just as much information. But if you put one device in there and leave it for 6 months, you have zero momentum at the end of that 6 months. So yeah, we would really try to hone in on what success looked like to them, and is that the remaining step for them to make a decision to move forward.
Mhm. I'm
that's-
seeing your nod more than usual. Do you have something that you're like, my God, I can relate because we just had this happen with us, kind of thing?
No, not really. But I understand the sales. I'm appreciating the ability you had, or the strategy you had to not let the customer dictate the schedule, because I agree that often is a huge delay.
Nick, I'm interested in your perspective of what you're hearing. Nick, I'll let him introduce why I'm calling on him. Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. This is awesome, and you can see I'm multitasking, day job and listening to this at the same time. That with letting hospitals, just what you just said, letting hospitals determine, the time that they get to trial something. Can we just give this a shot for 6 months? And it's like, you could be desperate for the sale and desperate to make friends and say, yeah, I'll let you do that. But we know what they're doing. They're going to drag this out as long as they can and get some free product, and that helps their top line, bottom line for a period of time, and then they get habituated to it and go, I don't know, it's comme ci comme ça. My question, I think, would just be about is you had these discussions with hospitals, hospitals in particular, not necessarily physicians. How did the reimbursement discussion go?
And if you would, Nick, just for context, tell them what you presently do and why you're my go-to for health economics.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a health economist. I work full-time for Boston Scientific, but I started a biotech company a number of years ago, and we took it public on NASDAQ. And so then I do consulting, and on the side, work with startup companies trying to figure out reimbursement, health economics, market access, value analysis committee type discussions too.
When I'm boasting about my friend Nick, I say that he was the guy at Intermountain Health who would give on whether or not a product would be reimbursed.
Got it.
And he mentioned his startup. And then it went public, and that's why he's still working today.
No, that's great. And it's great background. And I certainly don't want anyone to think that I'm sitting here saying we just grabbed the bull by the horns and we dictated where it went. We really had to go get clinical evidence as quickly as, or clinical champions as quickly as possible, right? Because anything you're selling, when it comes down to $1, I now have several close friends that are executives within health systems, and they say the thing everyone needs to ask themselves, because this is what we ask ourselves, is are you adding cost per patient to the system, right? Or are you removing cost per patient to the system, for the system? And when you're adding cost, that's a really, really difficult thing to sell, right? Regardless. And so I will say, I love to negotiate anyway. So if I ever got pushback and someone said, we're not doing a 2-week eval, the minimum we'll do is 4 or 6 weeks, right? I immediately go into, what is the risk of doing that, right? Let's see how interested they really are in moving forward. So is this really the final straw for them to move forward with us and buy our product? What's the size of the opportunity, right? I mean, if this was a $10 million deal, I think we'd consider it, right? Give it more consideration. If it was maybe like a key logo, like the Mayo Clinic, right? Or someone like that. I mean, you certainly need to be flexible, but at the same time, I would always push back and say, look, we're willing to support a 2-week evaluation with X amount of product. If you want to extend past that, are you prepared to pay for the product, right? It's literally just another litmus test to find out how serious are they, right? Like they're just looking for free stuff, or they want to appease some physician that really wants to do a study, and you've told him no 10 times, and this is his angle to be able to do a study. You're just trying to flush out, is this going to lead to a favorable outcome for us for a financially beneficial decision, right? And especially with oximetry early on, it wasn't even a standard of care when I joined Masimo. So interestingly enough, every ventilated patient wasn't even on a pulse oximeter. And related to reimbursement, so Nellcor, if you're not familiar, they're the ones that really kind of commercialized the pulse oximeter. And they had this really long road and uphill battle of trying to get it adopted. And as I understand it, within the anesthesia community, their malpractice insurance got dramatically reduced, or their premium, if they used a continuous pulse oximeter during every procedure. As soon as that happened, those things flew off the shelves. I mean, they were selling them as fast as they could make them into the OR, right? So that was kind of their entry point. By the time Masimo came on the scene, they were still using capital to purchase them, but around this time, all of the major multi-parameter monitor companies started integrating pulse oximetry as one of the major vital sign parameters, right? And so this might be a good segue into the operational side of this. We thought Joe Chiani had lost his mind when he sat in the executive boardroom with one of the top 2 largest multi-parameter monitor companies at the time, and they offered him a significant amount of money for a sole source. And they would only put Masimo in all of their equipment moving forward, which would have meant like over 5 years, probably 50% market share, right? Like no brainer. He told him no. And everyone thought he was the craziest person on the planet, right? Here's the little guy, right? The dog finally caught the car and he let it go. And the reason was he was so convicted about the impact that this technology could have on every single patient that he wanted every OEM out there to have an opportunity to integrate it, and every patient that was ever in a hospital to have access to the technology. And
who was it that, you don't need to give a name, but what was the dynamic of this, oh my God, opportunity?
So think about, here's this little brand new startup, and
that.
the largest players said, we want to buy the exclusive rights so that our competitors and no one else can have your technology. We are the ones that want it integrated into our equipment, right? As a competitive advantage for them.
Sure. And what became of that opportunity? Did they say, okay, well, we'll still buy your thing?
They integrated, so did their competitor, and before long there were 40 OEMs that had Masimo as an option. So here's really the genius behind that, moving into the operational side. Fast forward, once we started gaining more market share, what we could do is go into any hospital. It didn't matter if they had Philips, GE, Space Labs. Well, back then it was like the HP Merlins. I don't know if you guys remember that equipment. But I mean, there wasn't a multi-parameter monitor out there that we didn't have an upgrade path. And not, let's put one of our boxes next to it. It was, hey, our team can come in, pull the brains out of that device, replace the board, and put Masimo board in there, put it back in, seamless to the end users, right? The nurses and the staff. But the patient could get one sensor, they could get it in the ED or wherever, and they could go all the way through the hospital and it would plug into that socket no matter where they went. Standardization was enormous, an enormous competitive advantage. Our biggest competitor would come in and say, yeah, we'll give you 80 standalone oximeters. You can bring them in when you have a challenging patient, right? That didn't fly. Our OEM, not only partners, but solutions gave us a humongous leg up. All the way down to what I think was also really, really pivotal for us. If you would have looked at our offering compared to our competitors' offering, they would have, call it 40 standalone devices in there. And we would walk floor by floor in every single device that had a pulse oximeter socket, we called it, or board in it. We would document that. We would have a solution for that. And we would upgrade 1,000 devices, right? And at that point, they don't need all these standalones that they don't even have room for or store anyway. But we would still give them, what they felt was appropriate amount, 10 or 12, whatever that looked like, to use for certain applications. And so when you look at the value of the contract, not only did the technology speak for itself, but we had like a seamless upgrade standardization path, and it was apples and oranges, right? So the other beauty that I think Joe and the way his mind works is he created an upgradable platform. One of the challenges in every hospital is there's no room for equipment, right? So he created a pulse oximeter that was essentially like a cell phone, like an iPhone, with every new parameter that the Masimo Labs created or developed or launched. It was essentially an app on the device. So you wanted to add non-invasive hemoglobin, carboxyhemoglobin, methemoglobin. It was an app. It was a software upgrade. You didn't need another box for every one of those things, right? Cerebral oximetry, EEG. It's all in that device. So he was genius from a standpoint that once we could get into an account, we could get all of our equipment in there. Our competitor wasn't going to come back in and swap out 1,000 Philips devices, right, with their board in it. And so we knew that was not only a competitive advantage, but talk about stickiness. We would have that account for at least 10 years, right? And all of our revenue came from a disposable sensor. So every parameter they launched had a disposable product associated with it, a recurring revenue model, and an upgradable platform. So you could talk about clinical obsolescence, reducing risk, right? Technological obsolescence. You buy this one device, it's fully upgradable. And it just really resonated not only with biomed. I used to love the saying, biomed isn't going to win you a deal, but they sure will stop one, right? And so when you can go get a win for biomed, and this is where I think we did really well. We had a story for every single department in the hospital: biomedical engineering, NICU, PICU, PACU, OR, adult ICU, SICU, MICU. I mean, you name it. I didn't even know there were so many ICUs. But we had clinical evidence, we had solutions for them, we could solve problems that they were having. And at the end of the day, I mean, it was almost like unanimous votes by the time it got back to value analysis and new product committee. Like, unless there's some financial reason not to do this, we have to do this, right?
You've been patient, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. This is an extremely informative and interesting story. And I apologize for coming in late, but I am also working at the same time that these are going on. But I had a question. What was the regulatory pathway to this? Is this a SaaS? Is this software as a medical device? How did you refer to this? And what was the regulatory pathway to get? If you haven't answered this yet, I'd really appreciate finding out what your regulatory pathway was to getting this out there.
Was software as a medical device even a term back then, Scott?
No.
No.
No, it
So,
wasn't.
so what's does the FDA have anything to say about that today about that, or have they looked back at that, or is this just one of those grandfathered things in because it's just, they can't get around to it yet? I'm just kind of interested to see what the regulatory people think about this.
So from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, it's class 2 medical device, but it was, I mean, originally it was a standalone, tabletop pulse oximeter. So, I mean, they followed all the standard patient monitoring requirements, but where I think they were able to sort of piggyback on the Philips of the world that had a multi-parameter monitor, and this was just one parameter inside of their device. And so Masimo could put their already FDA cleared board inside of the Philips device. So I don't believe they needed any additional regulatory approval. That would have fallen on Philips or GE or Space Labs, but the device itself, I mean, had all the standard clearances.
Yeah,
Or
that kind of makes
physio
sense.
control,
Or physio control, yeah, that's
or
another
physio
one.
control. Yeah, that's where I worked. So
I had,
we
I had
actually used Masimo.
Yeah, I had a customer that was actually taking and introducing a communications module. It's a software communications module to actually go from an EKG monitor, something that they would be using out on with EMTs and outside the hospital, and be able to transfer the data, not diagnose, but transfer the data from the existing system to the hospital. So the only thing they would have had to do was just implement that control module through the Wi-Fi into their systems integrated in the hospitals. And the person running the company was wondering, how do we get this through as a medical device? I got a hold of the FDA and I got them to actually say, as long as you're not diagnosing, if you're just transferring the information, it's not a medical device. It's not software as a medical device. You don't have to worry about getting FDA permission. So I was just kind of wondering if this was along the same lines.
Got it. Yeah, well, it is interesting because I know, and I won't name a parameter, but I know they had so many different technologies and things that they could determine just non-invasively through light, that they wanted to create this one number, right? And the problem with that they had was the FDA came back and said, okay, so if the number from 1 to 100 is 74, what does that mean? And show me the evidence, right? Like, well, there's so many things contributing to it. Like, it could mean a lot of things, right? It's just supposed to be like a holistic view of how healthy the patient is. But they ran into a lot of regulatory problems with that because, I mean, you'd have to have so much data behind it to make any kind of claim, right? And that never really came to fruition. But outside of that, I will say pulse oximetry as a whole, and this was after I left, really started getting scrutinized for the African-American population. It wasn't as accurate, right? Or maybe the skin pigmentation and differences weren't being taken into account. And so I know there are some technologies that are trying to come to market and they're having a really difficult time getting FDA clearance because they don't have enough clinical evidence to show the same accuracy and specificity on Caucasians, Black skin, Asian, whatever. And they're really cracking down on that. So
yeah, I agree. I've seen that FDA's actually, I've seen the different products coming in, the FDA actually stopping them, saying you don't have enough cross references across different racial groups and different ethnic groups. So you need to prove to us that this works across the board. It's not just on one class of people. So good on you. That's great. Thank you so much for this information. I really appreciate this.
Oh, you're welcome. And I see one more hand raised.
Okay, it's me. I want to cling to Mark's question on the regulatory pathway. I'm from the Netherlands, and I don't think Masimo is that big in Europe. Is it because of that regulatory pathway? Because as I see it, if you cling to a Philips system, then Philips is still the legal manufacturer of the system. So you have to certify it at a notified body as a system together, and you have to give all your regulatory information to Philips or otherwise. Mm-hmm. I mean, we did use one of your competitor products from Nonin, and we got a whole bunch of regulatory information and test information, and even that wasn't enough for the notified body to get it certified as a system.
Interesting. I mean, I know Masimo has a footprint in Europe. I think part of the challenge they run into, and this is probably a whole other topic, you guys have nationalized health and we don't. And so we still do fee for service. And I mean, I hate to say they get away with, but every patient going in gets a throwaway sensor that's, $10 or whatever. And And so heads in beds makes money. Over there, it's you want to keep people out of the hospital. You use a reusable finger clip, which means there's no recurring revenue stream, right? And even
Yes.
though Philips is one of their big, we call it a co-opetition, right? Like we cooperated, we were OEMs, but we were also competing against each other because they have their own SpO2, not only technology, but sensor lines, right? And so if they lead with a reusable sensor and they can offer less cost because it's their own technology, I think that's one of their competitive advantages for sure, over in Europe. But I'm not as intimately familiar with that market. I didn't sell into it, but I know a majority of the revenue definitely came from the US.
Okay, and they came a lot from the reusables, from the disposables, I mean?
Oh, to my knowledge, Europe still uses reusables majority.
Yeah, it's also it's getting a new law that you even if you bring something disposable to the market, it's not allowed to keep somebody off the market who reuses or rebrands or cleans the disposables for reuse.
You can't stop that from happening?
No.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one. So there are third parties, and believe it or not, near the end of my tenure there, our biggest competitor was not another SpO2 manufacturer. It was third-party collection companies. So they would go around in the hospital, right? Anything that could be possibly reused or cleaned, or they just throw them in these buckets. And so they would take them back, and they'd have a whole process where they would clean it, put a new adhesive on it, package it, and resell it for, I mean, oftentimes a third of what the cost of a new one was. And so Masimo, part of their technology, they put an XCal chip in it so that it would time out, or it needed the same OEM board that originally turned it on in order for it to work again, right? Like they were trying to find ways to stop that from happening. And part of the reason, I mean, you can't, you
How
certainly
long did it take to develop that workaround? I'm curious.
Oh gosh, I'm sure they had it all along, but just never used it.
Mhm. By the
First
way,
time I've heard of somebody actually using something to stop people from using their product. So this is interesting.
Oh, that happens all the time. I know. See, Scott, I told you didn't need to prepare anything because here you are on the first slide that has anything beyond your name and your family, and we're 45 minutes into this conversation. So
Well, I know, and that's
and
why I
I only
said that.
prepared like 2 more slides, but you got up to a third of the first slide.
And right, and I will say I this was the only slide that I actually threw together because I could talk for hours on each of these topics, but probably the most interesting financial piece, right? And so I'm a mentor for a couple startup founders here in Charlotte. I'm part of Innovate Charlotte and a facilitator for a co-starter program for entrepreneurs that want to launch products. And so I see this a lot. They try to skip 1 or 2 of these really important pillars, right? And so they might have a clinical story, but they don't really have a good operational story, and it costs more, but it improves patient outcomes. They're going to have a really hard time getting that product to market, right? Others, they can have a really compelling financial story, but if they don't get the clinical buy-in, they're going to have just as difficult of a time. So this is kind of the trifecta. I mean, I saw this play out so well during my 13 and a half years there that it was almost a disservice, because when I left, I went to another startup non-invasive patient monitoring company, and we lacked a few of these things. And boy, oh boy, was it a longer road to capture market share. So I'll transition to the financial one because I think this also might kind of shed some light. So I put on here capital versus operational costs, right? So going back to the extremely detailed physical inventory, we called it, that we would collect in a hospital. Every hospital was different. So some needed 500 Philips upgrades, some needed 200 vital sign monitor upgrades, right? Like the whole mix of things. But by the time you get to the end of that value of what they need to standardize, I mean, it could be $1.5 million, right? And so they say, well, wait a minute, we don't have 100 or $1.5 million set aside for this project. We're interested in moving forward. But we have this ongoing cost for all of these sensors we're going to buy, right? And it might be $1 million and spend a year. So how can we make this happen? And what we would do is leverage our GPO contract price and say, well, if you commit term and volume, right? So sign a X amount of term contract, 5 years, you commit to buy $1 million worth of sensors, which is the volume you use now, for 5 years. We can recognize that as a $5 million opportunity, right? We can amortize the equipment over that time. You don't have to pay for it. We'll absorb the cost, right? So we took that capital need right off the table. And that was, I would say, 99% of most of our business, right? And that actually helped with a lot of things. You talk about, we used to talk about stickiness. We launched new technologies where someone was really interested and they'd buy a monitor and then they never used it, right? So that doesn't really do you much good if you have a recurring revenue model that you're trying to drive. And so we would get them to commit to a certain amount of volume, and we would provide the device at no charge, which then eliminated the need for capital approvals and the whole treasury component. But our clinical team was the one that would go in and make sure they were using it or drive the utilization, right? The sales team was focused more on finding opportunities, herding the cat, so to speak, getting in front of value analysis, uncovering clinical stakeholders, all of those things. But our contracts really drove compliance and drove that revenue for the organization. So I put in here guaranteed reduction. Early on, we would tell them, hey, look, you're going to get a reading the first time, you're going to use less sensors. And eventually they would say, let's do a risk share, right? Like that still comes up today. Put your money where your mouth is. If you're really going to impact our organization, put it in the contract. And so we would say, we'll guarantee to reduce at least 10%, maybe 20%, depending on the opportunity. And so if they were using 100,000 sensors, we'd commit them to 90,000 at the GPO price. If they exceeded the 90,000, we'd provide it at no cost. And then of course, if they went above that number, because they always lowball you with their volume, then they would have to start paying for it again, right? But we would put it in the contract. You address the financial stakeholders. How do I make sure that this isn't going to get out of control? How can I put down that we're going to actually save money, right? Back to the CFO. And how do we monetize this, or, come up with the capital, which we address that too. So another interesting thing on the financial part, they're obviously keen to the fact that you might try to Trojan horse them, right? So you come in small and then this thing's going to blow up and everyone's going to want it. And you're going to ultimately cost me $3 million. That's not happening. I'm keeping you out, right? Like that still happens to this day. What we were able to do back then is, even though they might have a GPO contract or a sole source agreement in place with our competitor, there was always a 20% carve out. And so if they were in a 5-year contract with our competitor, but maybe had 3 years left, we could go in and just focus on the NICU. That would fall within the 20% carve out. We could prove the clinical efficacy. And by the time we were about 6 to 12 months out from that contract expiring, the larger one, we would go over to the PICU and other areas and ultimately set ourselves up to expand and capture the whole place, which gave us a lot more volume, a lot more leverage. We could be more competitive financially. But I would definitely say starting small is huge, especially if you're launching a new technology. Be really, really good in one area. And once you prove yourself there, it's another great stomping grounds to get clinical data, clinical studies, publish, all of that kind of stuff.
Administrative notes, Scott. First, we don't have to hang up at the top of the hour. Some people will drop off, but we are recording. I know that Sue and Carla want to speak with you, and I'm going to call on Sanjeev, who's working on a point of care diagnostic now, as he has been for, as I understand it, a good part of his career. But Joey's curious about what's on slides 4 and 5. Can I just take a peek at them?
Sure.
Well, the
These
box
were
is
just like
smaller.
key takeaways. I know they kind of fell into 3 categories, and I wasn't going to spend a ton of time on that. And the last slide's just to thank you with my contact. So I'm happy to just answer questions. This is really more about like the approach Joe took, started with clinical. He never even wanted to hire a sales team. He leveraged GMs.
Because why? Why didn't you want a sales team for something? I would think something with the potential and realization that it ultimately had, that Masimo had. Why wouldn't he want feet on the street?
So he hired clinical folks, mainly respiratory therapists, to go do all the missionary selling and get the pull through for the OEMs, right? His vision was, there's no reason for us to recreate the wheel. Let me get Philips and GE and all these people just to put it in their devices, and then I'll let them bring it to market. But ultimately, that would create more momentum and the potential for a buyout, right? Like that's what he wanted early on. He didn't want to start this big company and hire salespeople and go try to win hospitals individually. He wanted to leverage the landscape to do it. And what he found very quickly was there were sole source and exclusives in place for the competition. The GPO contracts were blocking him and keeping him out, right? So you may remember that there were a lot of lawsuits around that. His competitor stole his IP. And so it was a combination of things that really ultimately launched him into, okay, game on, let's go to battle kind of thing. So his original goal was not to do what he's doing today, but lucky for him that it worked out that way. I guess just real quickly. So he started clinically, then the organizational structure, sales focused on new business, clinical did the evaluations, installs, and continuous follow-up. And then we had a humongous per diem pool. It was kind of a brilliant strategy. We would go into accounts, children's hospitals a lot of times, find really good respiratory therapists, add them to our per diem pool. When we would have big evaluations or installations, we would pull them in as per diems to help do all of the training. And once they did that enough, they'd go back to their hospital and they'd really fight to get us in there. So that was a smart strategy that paid off. The OEM partnerships, I talked about that. That helped us with standardization. The more detailed you can show your customer that you understand every single one of their problems that your product can solve, it's a humongous competitive advantage. It was a lot of work, but I really do believe that set us up to win a lot of business. And then building the platform, right? So it started with a recurring revenue model, multi-parameter, it was upgradable, all really important. And then the OEM board, certainly we shipped as many OEM boards as we did our standalone devices for, well, actually it outdistanced near the end, more OEM than we did direct. And then market capture versus market creation. I mean, we launched a lot of technologies after the pulse oximetry really became the bread and butter of the revenue. And some of those where you're trying to create a new market, you overlook the runway, you overlook the sales cycle. It's 12 to 18 months typically. If you're introducing something brand new that you have a really difficult time with a financial ROI, you might as well add 24 to 36 months onto that runway, and you have to do a lot of missionary selling. If Masimo wouldn't have had the recurring revenue coming in that it did, and if you just took one of their new parameters that they launched as a standalone device and that was all that they had, I mean, most of them would have failed, right? And so we had the luxury of having this recurring revenue to fund the long uptick in market adoption that was required for a lot of the future parameters. So that's really it.
Thank you. Sue? Okay, Carla?
So, well, thank you. We kind of moved on, but I think all great relevant points. I always talk about the clinical, operational, and financial buyer. I think now, especially as post-COVID, and I think also pre-COVID, it started to happen. It was more difficult to get into the hospitals. And so I always think that it's the importance of having that clinical data up front, even early on. I tell the startups I mentor, early on from a regulatory standpoint, so you're building up the story for the FDA, but also building that so that when you launch the product, you're not then thinking about post-market studies and the things that you're doing. I do think in many ways, sometimes Europe was ahead of us on the tenders, because I think this became, a requirement to break into the tender sometimes in Europe to demonstrate the clinical evidence, and it's just becoming more and more difficult in the US. I wanted to ask you if Masimo, we would do some things around risk sharing, and maybe in your experience, if you can share example of risk sharing, pay for performance type models where you can make an arrangement with the facility and then trace back to the data to demonstrate the actual clinical impact.
So most of our risk share was more financially driven, right? So we could say, hey, we'll save you 10% on your current spend, and we're going to give you 1.5 million and no cost equipment, right? All of those kind of things. They would always say, put it in writing, right? Like, you're going to save me 10% or 20%. How do I know? And so we would put it into the contract. And I think I touched on this a little bit, but we would put a guaranteed reduction in their spend. And as I mentioned before, not all, but a lot of hospital, supply chain, they're going to lowball you on what their volume is. so that, you know, when they're really doing the run rate that they're doing, they think they'll outdistance their contract and they can be done sooner. So that usually would end up coming back full circle. But by the end, if they really ended up purchasing a lot of additional equipment and technology, we would dig back into it with them and look at their admissions, look at the number of procedures they did, right? Like, I mean, it wasn't just face value. We would make them prove to us that we didn't uphold our end of the bargain, and that their clinical data and their number of patients that were being monitored mirrored the previous year, right? Versus they had a 25% increase in all of their admissions. So of course they're going to buy
It
more.
was more volume based.
It was
I guess
volume.
so. It was more volume based or some type of discount based on purchase versus tied to some of the clinical outcomes.
Yes, and I will say one of my good friends is the SVP of supply chain, and I'll never forget him saying, do you know that you're probably vendor number 80 that's come in here this week and told us that your technology is going to reduce the length of stay? How much do I give you for the other 80 companies, right? Do you get 1/80th of one particular patient's reduction in 3 hours and, you know, in their stay? Like, that doesn't really move the needle, right? And so I think unless there's a direct correlation of what you're doing, right? Or, I mean, you talk about throughput in an OR, right? Like you can do
or outcomes, right? Or, you know, from a litigious standpoint, whether it's throughput, I was thinking, or large capital, we would do it a lot with the large capital systems as well when it's over $1 million sales, or tying it to outcomes as well. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
At
Sure.
the top of the hour, some will drop off, but that's okay. Sue? You are on mute. Dr. Sue, you're on mute.
I have a small medical device that I'm a pharmacist by trade. I saw a problem with filtering ampule-based medication, that it could cause glass shards to the patient if not filtered, or wasted time, or increased needle stick injuries, because you need one needle to filter it, and then you need to exchange it with another needle, so it can cause needle stick injuries. So we developed an all-in-one package, one needle filter, basically by just relocating the filter. We're just a few months away from FDA doing final preparations, so we're conducting summative at this point. We realize that it's new way of filtering, and not all the nurses understand it. So we actually ran our own clinical studies for like $2,000 in Amazon gift cards for everybody that came out, not even for 20 participants. And what we found was, especially labor and delivery nurses, because every vitamin K is packaged in a glass ampule up until 5 years ago. Then it came in a big, bulky, expensive boxes. So none of the hospitals are buying it right now. So they're back to ampules, and every baby when they're born gets that vitamin K in a glass ampule. So the labor and delivery nurses actually brought tears to my eyes how much they loved it and appreciated it. And we had a scale from 1 to 5, and I would say 21 out of 21 participants rated it a 5. So now we feel more confident, and we did this to figure out what type of training that's going to be required. And we showed a 20-second video. And from that 20-second video, 20 out of 21 participants got it from the video. And we had such a tremendous success rate. We feel really confident that now we can prepare for summative studies, which are going to cost, $30,000 to $50,000 or even more. But it was golden. So I totally agree with what you said, and we have positive proof.
Please show me that video. Send it to me on Slack at least.
Let's see, the IFU video.
The one that you said, the 20 out of 21.
Oh, let's see if I can pull it up.
Offline, of course. Sanjeev, I wanted to call on you before we concluded.
Hey, thanks, Scott. This is very informative. Would love to catch up with you. Like Joe said, I've been doing a startup for a while in the IVD space for cancer diagnostics. Some of the learnings which you talked about would be very useful as we move forward. So would love to talk to you about that and get some feedback. We are raising our funding right now. We expect to have that closed. Well, we had a term sheet. It hasn't yet closed, but hopefully we can get that closed and move forward. We are probably about 6 months from going into clinical studies. We have done in-house studies and they look good. So
God, if you would share your screen again, that last slide, so Sanjeev and others know how to find you. And I've invited Elizabeth to name drop. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
So, small world. So I attended the Patient Safety Movement Foundation with Joe Kiani June 1st. And we were just profiled in their newsletter in their innovation corner for our little product.
And what's your little product?
So we have a new low technology communication system to identify high alert medications. And my whole team came out to the meeting. There were maybe 300 people there. I don't know if you ever, well, have you attended any of his? It's only 10 years
Sure you
old.
did. I did too.
Yeah. So we were there and they profiled us just this week, actually. So it's really nice. Nice to hear your story and to hear really the background and details of it all.
Yeah, and thank you again for having me. This has been, kind of fun and a walk down memory lane, actually. But I've just seen so many of these principles play out, even other places that I went afterwards. And going back to the clinical work, I think I hadn't even really considered that, but with all of the other companies that I've helped and or consult with or talk to, I really think it's important when you're doing your clinical work to interview as many hospital administrators as possible to find out what information they need to make a decision, right? An informed decision. Clinical is great, but what are those outcomes that are going to move the needle for a hospital moving forward? I mean, sometimes you can show that there's a better outcome, but I think the more hospitals you talk to, the more you'll start finding like there's really specific data that we need in order to move forward. And I'll say this, even though you're solving a specific problem, doesn't mean they document the problem. So going back to Sue, you were talking about your clinical work, everyone's on board, right? Like I've seen this before too. All the clinicians say, this is such a no-brainer, we need this. And then it gets all the way up to the CFO and they say, show me in the data where we have this problem, right? And if it's not documented, it doesn't mean you're not going to win their business. It might not be right the second, but you need to get them to start documenting how often they have the problem that you're solving. And a lot of times, you know as well as I do, it can be politically motivated or I don't know how you would want to say it, but they're not going to document problems that there's not a solution for, that that would highlight that they have an issue, even though everyone has the issue. And so I saw this repeatedly. And when we had that strong clinical support, we would ask them to start documenting it when it happened. And a lot of times there was a lot of internal turmoil over them doing that. But ultimately, I can tell you, we would walk in and say, how often do you have this problem? And they would say, well, if you look at paper, we never have it, but we can go round right now and I'll show you 20 patients that have that problem, right? So the clinicians get it far different than your ROI and financial story. That's why it's so important to have the clinical, operational, and financial pieces buttoned up.
Scott, I speak for everyone when I say we enjoyed this very much today. Welcome to our extended family. And I just signed a contract for 10X for 2024. Andre, you'll want to plan your vacation with your wife on May 1st and 2nd to blow off yet another event with a really good excuse. And we will not be in San Diego. We will be at the Hyatt Regency in Newport Beach.
Fabulous.
So I've gone a little north, and Newport Beach dangled a financial incentive to get me to move, and I'm cheap. So.
Well, as a champion, I have to say, as a champion of Joe's group, Nick Anderson is our health economist who has done a tremendous amount of work for us, and lots of other people who are part of the Friday morning group. So again, thank you. And Scott, it was great to hear your story with Masimo.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you can join us next year in Newport Beach. And this year's keynote was Mick Farrell, returning for a second time, CEO of ResMed. I've spoken with Joe Kiani's office a few times, and he's been elusive, but you know a guy. So
I can put in a call.
April 30 is that Tuesday. If we can get on his calendar, I met him at the patient safety event. you know, and I imagine he was delightful to work with. Perhaps it's different when but I found him to be very charming and very attentive, and exactly the kind of spirit and heart that I look for in our community. So
That's great.
that would be lovely to have him join us. Big holiday week ahead. I hope everyone has some plans to take some time off in the US, perhaps elsewhere, Luke. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Great
Thank
program.
you, Scott.
Thank
Happy
you. Happy holiday, everyone.
Bye now.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Joe.